This deep dive is brought to you by Tybootha. You know, the profound work of Rocco A. Errico and George M. Lamsa actually laid the groundwork for the Nura Foundation.
That's right, and the Foundation is still actively sharing their really illuminating teachings today.
Welcome, everyone, to the deep dive. This is where your curiosity leads the way. You send us sources and, well, we dig into them, try to pull out the core insights for you. A bit of a shortcut, really.
And today, you've sent us on a really fascinating mission. We're going deep into a Semitic perspective on Jesus.
Okay.
We're using excerpts from the Nura Introduction to Aramaic Light.pdf as our guide here. And the goal is to shed light on the cultural and linguistic background of Jesus's life, things that often get overlooked.
Yeah, it really makes you think, doesn't it? How our own cultural viewpoint, our lens, kind of colors how we see historical figures.
Hmm.
The text mentions that, like the classic image of a fair-haired, blue-eyed Jesus in Western art. Or, other cultures depicting him in ways that reflect their own people.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And while that shows just how universal his message became, it can also sort of obscure the very specific world he actually lived in.
Right.
From a Semitic standpoint, as the text really emphasizes, there's a unique closeness, a claim almost to understanding him because, well, he was one of them.
Uh-huh. Born and raised there, speaking their language.
Born and raised in the Near East, speaking Aramaic, living by their customs.
Yeah. Okay, so let's really try and picture this. The Semitic Jesus. What would someone from that background, what would they have imagined?
Well, think about a man in the Near East. So probably a darker olive complexion, warm brown eyes, a full beard and mustache. Pretty typical features for the region.
Okay.
The text suggests they likely saw him as, physically strong, masculine, perhaps even quite tall. It's a very different picture than the one many Westerners might hold.
Definitely different. And how would he have communicated?
Yeah.
His speaking style?
Well, imagine speech just filled with vibrant imagery, almost larger than life sometimes. The text mentions a tendency towards what might seem like maybe exaggeration to us.
Okay.
But that was a common way of expressing deep feeling or importance in the Near East. Yet at the same time, his stories had this incredible simplicity, often focusing on just everyday human connections told poetically, sometimes with, humor or building tension. It wasn't just what he said, but how he said it, deeply rooted in that culture.
So the whole package content delivery was Semitic. The text also mentions his very human side?
Absolutely. And this is really key, I think, to understanding him in context. He wasn't some, detached, ethereal figure.
Right.
He felt the whole range of human emotions, deep love, sure compassion, but also, frustration, irritation even, and profound sorrow. This kind of emotional intensity is presented as part of the Near Eastern temperament.
It feels like a paradox, almost.
Yeah.
This person, so deeply tied to one specific ethnicity, one culture, has had this enormous universal impact.
Precisely. It's beautifully put in the text. Despite his background, his appeal just transcends national boundaries, doesn't it?
Yeah.
His spiritual wisdom, his practical teachings, they just resonate everywhere,
Yeah.
making him, in a way, a man without a country, yet claimed by all.
And despite coming from, humble beginnings, he connected with everyone. Rich, poor, it didn't matter.
That's right.
Now, to get a clearer picture of his world, the text points us towards the descendants of the ancient Assyrians. Why them? Why are they so important here?
Well, the core idea is that these descendants remarkably preserved a Semitic way of life. Near Eastern traditions that remained largely unchanged for, thousands of years. Right up to the early 20th century, basically.
Wow.
Living in Mesopotamia, Kurdistan. Their customs offer this unique window into the world Jesus would have known. It's almost like a living history book.
So how did they manage that, to stay so kind of insulated from all the big historical shifts?
Geography played a big part. The text explains their homeland was this rugged, mountainous region north of Iraq, kind of off the main paths of conquest.
Ah, okay.
So they were largely untouched by the Greeks, the Persians, Arabs, Mongols, Turks, all these waves of influence that swept through the more accessible areas. They were, in many ways, living on a different timeline.
That's quite something. You mentioned they even had their own name for the Turks. That says a lot about their isolation.
Yes, that's a fascinating detail. Until around 1910, they apparently called the Turks Romaya,
Mamaya.
which means Romans,
Yeah.
because the Turks entered their area through Asia Minor, which was once part of the Roman Empire, not directly from Mesopotamia. It just highlights how differently they perceived the wider world.
And this isolation was key to preserving their language and customs, maybe even more so than other Semitic groups.
Absolutely. The text really emphasizes this. Their cultural survival is described as, well, extraordinary. Other Semitic cultures saw languages change, get replaced, customs altered. Even within Judaism, ancient Hebrew became mostly a language for scholars, needing, extensive commentaries to understand the original texts.
And the text quotes Dr. W. A. Wigram on this.
It does, a powerful quote. He called them an astonishing survival, tucked away, preserving the most primitive of Semitic customs to a degree you just didn't see elsewhere.
Right.
He noted their daily life before World War I changed things really mirrored the world of the Old Testament. It just underscores how valuable their perspective could be for understanding that whole biblical era.
It really does. Such potential for unique insights. Okay, what about the language? The language Jesus himself spoke.
That would have been Aramaic.
Definitely.
And Aramaic. The text points out that even today, Assyrians and Chaldeans in the Near East and, in diaspora communities still speak Aramaic.
Huh. Still spoken today.
Yes, though it's facing challenges, sadly, among younger generations in some places. But it's not just some dead language we're deciphering. It has living roots.
And it wasn't just any Aramaic, right? It was a specific regional dialect.
That's right. The Aramaic spoken in Galilee, where Jesus grew up, was the everyday language, the vernacular of northern Palestine.
Okay.
And this linguistic situation developed centuries before Jesus, actually. After the Assyrian Empire conquered the northern kingdom of Israel back in 721 BC,
Right.
they repopulated the area with people from places like Edessa, beyond the Euphrates, who spoke Aramaic. So Aramaic had been the main spoken language there for a very long time.
So Hebrew still existed, but Aramaic was the language of daily life for most people in Galilee.
Precisely. Hebrew had largely faded as a common spoken language by then. Interestingly, the text mentions that even some Jewish communities in places like northern Mesopotamia and Kurdistan kept speaking and praying in Aramaic dialects. They called it Lashon HaGaluf, the language of the exile. So Aramaic had an enduring presence within Jewish communities too.
What made Aramaic so widespread in the first place?
It really rose to prominence because of the Assyrian Empire. Their long influence made it the lingua franca, the common language for trade, diplomacy, communication across the Near East.
Ah, like English today, sort of.
Exactly. And it stayed that way even after the Assyrian Empire fell, under the Babylonians and Persians too.
So different dialects existed, but the northern one became the standard for writing.
Yes, the dialect of Edessa, which is also known as Syriac, became the main literary standard, largely because it was used in early important translations of the Bible.
Right.
The text even gives that Old Testament example, King Hezekiah's officials asking the Assyrian ambassador to speak Aramaic, not Hebrew, because they understood Aramaic better for diplomacy. Shows its importance even way back then.
And the text mentions that the Aramaic in Palestine might have been a bit different from the more formal version.
It suggests that, yeah, because Palestine was smaller, maybe less cosmopolitan than the big empires like Assyria or Babylonia, its Aramaic vocabulary might have been a bit more limited.
Like a local dialect versus the standard language?
Kind of like that, yes.
Yeah.
A smaller range compared to the big literary form used across empires.
It's fascinating that even people like Josephus, writing around Jesus' time, used Aramaic. And the text argues Aramaic has stayed pretty consistent.
Yes, and a key piece of evidence they point to is that many Aramaic words found in the Greek New Testament are still understood, still used in Aramaic today, spoken and written.
Wow.
And Dr. Wigram comes back here. The text quotes him again, emphasizing the Assyrians' strong claim to be unique among Christian nations, maybe with a few exceptions in Lebanon, in still speaking the language of Palestine from the first century.
Christ's own language?
A language of Christ himself, yes. It really highlights how crucial understanding Aramaic is to getting closer to the original meaning.
Absolutely. Okay, so moving beyond language, the text also talks about ancient biblical customs these Assyrian descendants preserved. What are some examples?
Oh, the list is incredible. Really eye-opening. They kept aspects of biblical culture alive that go back even before the big Old Testament events, like before Nineveh, before
Right.
Abraham's journey.
Like,
Well, things like a semi-nomadic lifestyle, using goat hair tents, though, that was fading. The text notes how they built houses in northern Iraq, apparently very similar to how it was done in Hammurabi's time.
no way.
Yeah, using animal skins for storing water or wine, muzzling oxen when they were threshing grain, just like it says in the Bible, using simple earthen ovens heated with gathered grass. separating sheep and goats. These weren't just stories for them. It was their life.
Hearing those details, it makes that ancient world feel so much closer.
It really does. They used simple clay lamps lit with butter, ground grain by hand, often two women working together, used donkey-powered millstones for olive oil, carried goods on their backs or on animals. They told time by the rooster crowing or by shadows, no clocks, obviously. Even traditional roles persisted. Spiritual healers, blacksmiths, silversmiths, scribes using reed pens. And their clothing styles stayed largely the same, wanting to keep those ancestral traditions.
The text mentioned a report from Baghdad in 1933. Sounded like stepping back in time.
Yes. Describing the bazaars looking just like biblical times. People sacrificing sheep to seal agreements, Sabaean silversmiths studying the stars like the Magi.
Wow.
And the text contrasts this starkly with Palestine and Syria, which had already become much more modernized by then. It really highlights the unique preservation among the Assyrians.
So the argument is, to really get Jesus' gospel, his movement, you have to see it in this context, Judaism and its wider Semitic roots. It didn't just appear out of thin air.
That's fundamental. The text stresses they're not separate things. It's a progression.
Yeah.
Judaism is the seed, and Jesus' teachings, which became Christianity, are the flower.
Okay.
It identifies Jesus as an Aramaic-speaking Semitic Jewish rabbi. Rabbi Yeshua bar Yosef is the name used, though, rabbi then maybe wasn't exactly like today's role.
Right.
And a lot of the problems we have understanding the Gospels come from not knowing these Jewish customs within that shared Semitic culture.
And the changes from Western influence in the Holy Land itself have kind of obscured those connections, whereas they stayed clearer with the Assyrians.
Exactly. Western culture has really changed the landscape, the customs, over time in the Holy Land. But these ancient ways remained more, undiluted among the Assyrians. The text actually argues the Gospels themselves are pretty straightforward, not inherently mysterious. The difficulty often comes from the huge gap between our modern Western ways and the biblical world.
Right.
That and the fact that Greek translations sometimes just couldn't fully capture the Semitic thought behind the words.
So the text is really saying we in the West need these Near Eastern perspectives to get the original Semitic context of Christianity and the Bible?
Absolutely. It hammers home that Semitic Christianity came before the Greek and Roman forms that dominated later in the West. Jesus, his first followers, they were Galileans, Jews, Syrians, Assyrians, all connected by heritage, language, culture.
Okay, the text also talks about Greek culture. It acknowledges its importance, but also points out how much it owed to the Near East.
Yes, and that's fair. Greece was obviously crucial for European civilization and was a major channel for ideas, religions, trade from the Semitic world. They inherited a massive legacy from the Near East, arts, sciences, developed over millennia,
Right.
and Christianity then spread into Europe through Greece, which is why Greek became the language of the New Testament and theology in Asia Minor and the West.
But the main flow of influence initially was Near East to Greece.
That's the key point the text makes. The Greeks adopted, they built upon foundations laid much earlier in the Near East. Things like writing systems, technology, complex societies. They were flourishing in Assyria and Chaldea centuries before Greece really hit its stride. Even Alexander the Great admired Babylonian culture so much he made Babylon his capital. That says something.
And even the Greek alphabet itself came from the Semitic world.
Indeed. They borrowed it directly.
Yeah.
The names of the letters alpha, beta, gamma, they come from Semitic words. Alep, the ox, Beth, the house, Kemal, the camel. Those 22 letters from the Aramaic and Hebrew alphabets basically form the foundation for European alphabets. Even the Armenians used the Aramaic alphabet for church initially.
So lots of foundational stuff came from the Semitic world. But the text argues Greek culture didn't really influence Jesus or his immediate Jewish followers.
That's a very strong claim in the text, yes. It asserts that Palestinian Jews at the time actively resisted non-Semitic influences. There were apparently even rules against learning or using Greek.
Really?
Yeah, the Talmud supposedly considered it a serious offense for a Jew to learn Greek.
Yeah.
It shows a real desire to keep their own cultural and religious identity pure,
And this resistance held strong in Jesus' time.
According to the text, yes. Palestinian Jews mostly stuck to their traditions, guarded their religion, customs, language very carefully. It quotes Ernest Renan, suggesting Jesus likely didn't even know Greek and stayed completely within Judaism.
And most Jewish literature from that whole long period, 4th century BC to 9th AD, was in Aramaic. Plus, Aramaic prayers are still used.
Exactly. And the ancient Christian churches in the Near East used Aramaic liturgies too,
Mm-hmm.
the text stresses you don't find Greek used for core religious functions east of the Euphrates.
Right.
And the fact that early Near Eastern texts use Aramaic words like Amshiha for Messiah and Shlehe for apostle instead of the Greek Christos or apostolos, that points away from Greek influence at that early stage.
The text also mentioned the Greeks changing Aramaic names.
Yes, Hellenizing them. Bar Hebraeus noted it, like Nok becoming Nokhaus,
Yeah.
which is Noah, Eshoah becoming Isis or Jesus.
Uh,
And while some Greek loanwords popped up in Aramaic, the text argues that just because some Jews had Greek names didn't mean they spoke Greek fluently, like people adopting local names today in other countries.
right.
The Septuagint, that Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, that was mainly for Jews in Alexandria who didn't understand Aramaic anymore. It wasn't really used in Palestine, where Hebrew and Aramaic were understood.
Okay.
And Semitic Christians in the Near East generally preferred the Peshitta text of the Hebrew Bible, not the Greek Septuagint.
Okay, so all this background leads to the big question about the Gospels themselves. The text argues strongly they were originally written in Aramaic.
That's the central argument, yes. The idea is if Jesus himself had written them, maybe they'd be different. But they were written by his followers in Galilee, in their own language, Aramaic, for their own people.
Makes sense.
These Galilean disciples, they spoke Aramaic. They probably didn't have big libraries of scripture handy. They'd naturally record what they remembered in the language they lived in.
Huh?
The Gospels were first meant for people who knew Jesus or knew people who knew him, appealing to the ordinary folk around Galilee.
And Jerusalem, being more international, maybe wasn't the first audience.
That's implied. A more diverse place, more languages, maybe less initially focused on this specific story from Galilee. The text quotes Dr. F.C. Burkett, who thought Jesus and the disciples spoke Aramaic and the Gospels could well be translations from Aramaic originals, rooted in the Judaism of the time.
The text used the example of logos in John's Gospel.
Yes, how its translation into the Northern Aramaic miltha, meaning just word, rather than the Southern Aramaic memra, which had a more kind of divine utterance feel that suggests a Northern Aramaic origin for John.
Interesting.
It also quotes scholars like Dahlman and Burney on how widespread Aramaic was in Palestine even before and after the exile. And it suggests an early writing date for the first gospel, maybe only 15 years or so after the crucifixion,
Wow, that early.
when memories were fresh, yeah.
Yeah.
And writing it down in their own language would be the practical thing to do. Later Greek translations and putting things together could explain some complexities.
That analogy about a Japanese person trying to write down the Gettysburg Address without knowing English?
It's powerful, isn't it?
Yeah.
It highlights how unlikely it is that the Gospels were originally composed in Greek by these Galilean followers without some underlying Aramaic source.
Yeah.
Plus, the text points out how literal translations of Semitic idioms into Greek caused problems, like he breathed on them, probably just meant he encouraged them in Aramaic.
Right.
The Gospels, it argues, were like outlines.
Mm-hmm.
They assumed people understood the issues of the day. If later Greek writers were the originals, they'd likely have had to explain a lot more for their audience.
And the Aramaic words in the Greek text.
Exactly.
Hmm.
About 42 Aramaic words are in the Greek Gospels, sometimes with explanations. But the Peshitta, the Aramaic version, it's all Aramaic, no explanations needed. Direct contact with Greek ideas really shows up more in the epistles, where Paul is addressing non-Semitic communities and their specific issues.
Which brings us to comparing the texts and how mistranslations of Aramaic could create confusion in Greek and later versions.
Right. The text uses that analogy trying to understand Shakespeare if you don't know Elizabethan English.
Yeah.
He gives specific examples,
That's great.
like Luke 14.26, King James says, hate not his father and mother. But the Aramaic Peshitta says, put aside.
Ah.
The Aramaic word sana can mean both. The text argues put aside, meaning prioritize your commitment, is much more likely than literal hatred, which fits the context better. Similar things in Mark 10.3 about rewards. The Aramaic for maidservants apparently got translated as mothers, and pursuits or livelihoods became persecutions. And Luke 14.5, where the Aramaic for his son falling into a pit was confused with the similar word for his donkey.
Those specific examples really show how easily things could get twisted. The idea that gamla could be camel or rope, leading to the rope through a needle's eye.
Exactly. Or I must bury my father being an idiom for taking care of parents until they die, not that the father just died.
Right, not literal burial necessarily.
These nuances are just so easy to lose. The word ruha, spirit, wind, pride, even rheumatism, That could explain the woman suffering from a spirit, maybe having rheumatism, or poor in spirit being closer to humble, poor in pride.
Mm.
It keeps coming back to that word sna, hate, versus put aside, highlighting how jarring hate sounds in that Near Eastern context.
Mm.
And Jesus used vivid idioms. Cut off your hand probably meant stop stealing, referencing common punishments, not literal self-mutilation.
Like our idioms today that foreigners might take literally.
Exactly. Trying to explain kick the bucket or break a leg, they don't make literal sense outside the culture.
The text even tackles that really difficult saying in John about eating Jesus' body and drinking his blood.
Yes, explaining it as an Aramaic idiom, meaning to fully internalize his teachings, make them part of you, and be willing to suffer for them.
Okay.
It draws parallels to Aramaic sayings like, he has eaten the book, meaning he memorized it, or I've eaten my body and drunk my blood, meaning I've worked incredibly hard. It gives a framework.
Right.
Understanding cultural things, like how a bridegroom might be delayed arriving at a wedding, helps understand Jesus' analogy about the Son of Man's coming. Or the new wine in old wineskins, realizing they used actual goat skins that would burst if old and inflexible. It makes the incompatibility point much clearer.
Yeah, the physical reality.
Even the donkey and foal tied up apparently a common sight, like seeing taxis waiting today. Not necessarily some profound mystery in itself.
The text also gave some context for the King James Version and why maybe they didn't grasp these Near Eastern customs back then.
That's right. It was translated during a time of upheaval in Europe, but also a time when the Near East was pretty isolated because of the rise of Islam and the Ottoman Empire.
So less cultural exchange.
Much less. Hindered access to Eastern customs, perspectives. Early Western artists painted biblical scenes using European settings and clothes because, well, that's what they knew.
Which led to all sorts of cultural misunderstandings when interpreting the Bible, East versus West.
Yeah, the text lists examples, different roles for men and women, rules about hats and shoes, music and worship, how often people prayed, marriage customs, even how they perceived size. A small lake could seem huge, small boats like big ships, little territories like kingdoms.
So despite centuries of trying to translate and explain the Bible, the text suggests the confusion persists partly because of this historical disconnect, and the Near East being relatively silent on Western takes.
Exactly. The rise of Islam did have a huge impact on the Eastern Christian movement. There were periods of suppression, schools closed, churches converted, books destroyed, restrictions on Christian scholars. That historical reality limited the direct feedback from those closest to the original context on how the West was interpreting things.
But amidst all that, the Peshitta text holds a special place, according to the source.
Absolutely. Its preservation is described as almost providential. Even when other Christian writings were destroyed, the Gospels, especially in the Peshitta version, survived.
Okay.
And interestingly, the Quran and early Muslims respected the Gospels as God's word, and the version they recognized was the Eastern Aramaic Peshitta, meaning clear or straight, not the Western Vulgate, which they sometimes distrusted.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so the Peshitta is presented as the authentic text of the original Eastern Church. It was adopted by early Christians in India, the St. Thomas Christians, and it's still the accepted version for Christians throughout the Near and Middle East today. They never used the Vulgate.
And this original Eastern Aramaic version had a slightly different set of books.
Yes, initially 22 books. It notably didn't include Revelation or 4 of the shorter epistles. Revelation was accepted later by some Eastern churches after the Council of Nicaea, but not universally.
Okay.
The text suggests other Aramaic versions that differ slightly might have emerged due to historical events, like a treaty between Rome and Persia in 363 CE that shifted some territories and allowed Christians there to use their existing texts, which might have included books not in the standard Peshitta.
Right.
But it cautions against confusing these later, maybe regional versions with the ancient Peshitta, which predates all that and was quoted by early Eastern writers.
And finally, the text gives some really specific linguistic examples suggesting Aramaic was translated into Greek, pointing to the Peshitta's originality.
These are fascinating, like the tiny difference in Aramaic between Zara, seed, and Zarua, sower. Greek translators might have missed that, leading to the parable of the sower instead of the parable of the seed in Matthew 13, which fits the Peshitta. We mentioned gamla, camel, or rope. Greek used camel for the needle's eye, but the Aramaic rope idiom makes more sense.
Right.
Or the similar Aramaic words kakra, a talent coin, and karka, a province, differing by just a dot sometimes. This could explain the weird reward of cities in a parable in Luke 19, an error less likely if the original was Greek, where coin and city are totally different words.
That's very specific.
And one more, The nuance in John 12:4, Greek says he has blinded their eyes. But the Peshitta reads that their eyes have become blind, avaro, in Aramaic. A subtle grammatical difference suggesting the Peshitta might preserve the original passive sense better.
And beyond those translation issues, there were Aramaic words just left untranslated or changed in the Greek.
Exactly. Words like Rocco, mammon, ethpathak just carried over, and phrases like Eli, Eli, lemana shabachthani kept in Aramaic. Then some Aramaic words got translated into Greek words with slightly different shades of meaning, like toa, meaning envied, or emulation, may be translated as blessed, breka, in the Beatitudes. A literal translation might have sounded strange.
Okay.
It just shows how hard it is to translate idioms and colloquialisms perfectly. Meaning gets lost, languages change, words become obsolete. You have to consider the original phrasing.
Right.
The text also brings up medical terms. The ancient Near East didn't have our scientific understanding. Mental illness might be described as Dawana possessed by a devil, or just wild. This context helps understand passages about Jesus and devils, often likely referring to people with mental illnesses as understood then.
And more examples of literal interpretations causing confusion.
That word all is a great example. It can mean enter into, but also attack, wrestle, often just translated as enter into, which leads to the odd image of spirits entering into the swine in Matthew 8. But the Aramaic context could suggest the healed men attacked the swine, aggressively confronted them as a sign of their cure. The text says all is still used that way in Aramaic for attacks.
And Jesus' own speech was full of these colloquialisms.
Absolutely, when he breathed on his disciples. Probably an Aramaic way of saying he encouraged them, not necessarily the literal Holy Spirit at that exact moment, or the zeal of thy house hath eaten me up, an idiom for intense passion and courage because of his dedication. It's just like saying someone got fired in English. You don't mean literally set on fire.
Right.
So the text concludes this section by saying, look, comparing Aramaic and Greek, looking at all these examples, it really strongly supports an Aramaic origin for all four Gospels. Plus, Jesus spoke Aramaic, his followers spoke Aramaic, the early church in the Near East used Aramaic. It clarifies, too, when Paul talks about the Hebrew tongue in Acts, he almost certainly meant Aramaic, his mother tongue. We see Aramaic words like Abba, Awun, Maranatha in his letters.
So, just to summarize this crucial point, the text makes a very strong case for Aramaic as the original language of the Gospels.
Yes. Aramaic was the lingua franca for centuries. The Greeks called it Syriac because they confused Syria and Assyria. It was the common language spoken and written in Palestine, Syria, Asia Minor, Mesopotamia from the 4th century BCE to the 9th CE. It largely replaced Hebrew after the exile. Jewish writers used it, even in parts of Daniel and Psalms. It was the official language of the Persian Empire. Post-Christ Jewish literature, mostly Aramaic. Josephus used it. Hebrew then was more like an Aramaic dialect. And we talked about the Jewish resistance to Greek influence. The Peshitta Gospels barely mention Greeks using Ame, people Gentiles instead. Yonaya, Greek, only appears for the inscription on the cross. No mention of Greek philosophy. Plus, a major Greek text wasn't widely known in the West until Erasmus in 1516, based on later manuscripts, without Aramaic knowledge. That helped cement the idea of Greek being original.
While the first Aramaic compilation was much earlier, in Edessa.
Exactly. Edessa, a center of Aramaic learning with an early Christian community. The text argues against Bishop Rabulus being the originator of the Peshitta in the 5th century, saying the church thrived there long before him and needed gospels. His theology likely would have led him to include Revelation if he were translating from Greek, which he didn't.
So it grew organic.
That's the argument. A spontaneous growth from apostolic times, supported by tradition. Galilean Aramaic fits the style, the customs, the phrasing. The text is often tighter than the Greek. It keeps Semitic names right. Peter is almost always Simon or Simon Kepha. The Gospels read like outlines for people who knew the background. Even Luke's intro implies many earlier accounts existed, likely in Aramaic centers like Palestine and Edessa. So the conclusion is strong. Aramaic original, specifically the Peshitta. And the ultimate point of all this is to understand Jesus in his Near Eastern setting, Aramaic speaker, Semitic culture, while still recognizing his transcendent message. To reveal the human Jesus in his world. That's what commentaries like the Aramaic Light series try to do.
Wow. This has been an incredibly illuminating deep dive. Really shifts the perspective. So to recap the main points for everyone, Jesus was fundamentally a Semite living in a Semitic world.
Yes.
Understanding the Aramaic language he spoke, the ancient customs of his time, especially those preserved by Assyrian descendants, gives us absolutely crucial insights.
For sure, yeah.
And the text makes a really compelling case for the Aramaic origins of the Gospels, highlighting the Peshitta text as particularly significant.
Precisely. And appreciating this background, this context, can suddenly make passages that seemed obscure much clearer. It offers maybe a deeper, more authentic feel for Jesus' original message.
It really does. It definitely makes you think about how our own filters, our own cultural lenses shape how we understand things from the past. What other historical figures or religious texts might we see differently if we really tried to view them through their original cultural and linguistic eyes? Something to ponder. Thank you for joining us on this truly deep dive.